I won't be saying anything at all. We have two distinguished guests today, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be speaking. Before I introduce them, I'd like to first of all say welcome to my MBA class. This is actually a class that I teach.
Is it?
And because of the class, we open it up for the community. So I welcome my class. I'd like to welcome my former MBA students from last semester and years down. I'm seeing you all over the place. It's good to see you again. I'd also like to welcome the Rochester guests. This was open to the entire community. Welcome to this presentation, and we look forward to you participating, asking questions, getting anything you would like to know. I'd also like to thank Maria Brown. Is Maria, she steps in out all the time. Maria is the one that helped put this together from the town standpoint. She's the one that helped kind of get everything set up, and I would like to thank Maria Brown for doing that. She's the MBA program director here. It's going to be a 2-hour talk, and we're not planning on taking a break. We're just kind of go through this because it usually goes, and there's lots of questions and so forth. If you feel like you need to step out for some reason, feel free to do that. I'm just telling you, you've got permission from the professor to do that. You're welcome to do that. Let me introduce our two guest speakers today. This is something I've been teaching this course for 25 years, the MBA course in business ethics, which is what this course is. I have always wanted to have a prosecuting attorney and a convicted felon on the stage. And I've never been able to do that until now. So I am tickled that we've got both participants here doing that. Hank Shea. Hank is a senior distinguished fellow at the University of St. Thomas School of Law in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Hank is also a fellow at the school's Thomas E. Holleran Center for Ethical Leadership in the Professions. Shea, who has specialized in prosecuting a wide range of corporate and other economic crimes, was a federal prosecutor for 20 years in the office of the U.S. Attorney for the District of Minnesota. And he still serves there as a special assistant U.S. attorney. For the last 5 years, Hank Shea has appeared in more than 15 white-collar felons, most of whom he prosecuted, in more than 60 joint presentations at law schools, business schools, like we're doing here, universities, colleges, and high schools, as well as business conferences and public forums. And I'm sure Hank's going to tell us more about his life and his involvement in this case and the cases as he gets into that. But Hank, we welcome you today. David Logan, next to him, standing there. I first met David at the federal prison camp several years ago, and found him to be an articulate, excellent individual to share his experiences of what he went through, how he became a convicted felon, and kind of where he was at that point. I had him back to speak to my MBA class, I think it was this class last year. And I'm delighted that he would come and visit with us again. David has been out of the federal prison system since April of 2007. He is retired, and he's currently doing what I do. Living on a farm and raising chickens and sheep with his wife and having a great deal of fun doing that. So Hank and David, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, I think rather than stand right in front of you, I'll park it here and move around as we get going here. I have one slight correction to make. I should have caught it. Steve showed me the bio in advance, but I'm no longer a special assistant U.S. attorney. I finally cut the cord last August with the U.S. Attorney's Office, which means I don't have to give you the formal disclaimer that what I'm saying here today is not the view or the opinion or policy of the department. We'll skip all that. I'm here in my new capacity, and that's a law school professor, a fellow at St. Thomas, and somebody who I'm going to let you make a judgment about is trying to address the issue of business ethics in a way that traditionally has been taught and practiced. We'll see where you all stand at the end of our 2 hours here. This is meant to be informal. Dave and I have done this about 10 or so times at this point, and we find that the best learning that takes place often is in the second part of the program, where each of you get to ask your questions, particularly of Dave Logan, but also me. So we're going to talk, I think, for only about maybe 45 minutes here, split evenly between the two of us, and then we'll open up the questions. If somebody has a question that they want to get on the table right away, raise your hand and we'll tackle it. There's no set agenda here other than provide an educational opportunity for everybody in the room. So before we get started, let me take a poll. I like to do this, especially now when I'm traveling around the country, just to get a sense of where you all are at in terms of what I think is one of the biggest issues for our society. Not just white-collar crime, but all of the conduct that is unethical that can lead to white-collar crime. So 3 simple questions. I'd like everybody to vote. No, everybody stays on the fence. Yes or no for the first 2. The first question is the government doing enough to prevent and fight economic or white-collar crime? All those who say yes, the government is doing enough, raise your hand. All right, no? Who votes no? Well, usually it goes that way, but not quite with nobody saying yes. So that's instructive. Second question, when a white-collar offender is caught and convicted and is going to be sentenced, are the punishments for white-collar offenders typically adequate? Are white-collar defendants sentenced adequately? All those who say yes, raise their hand. Okay. So at least maybe 20. All those who say no. Pretty close, maybe 1 or 2 more. All right, the third question I think is the most interesting, and the one I'd like you to think about as we go through what you're going to hear today. You're the judge, and you have a white-collar defendant who's been convicted, and it's your role to sentence that person. And you have one of 2 choices to best achieve justice. You can't do both. Send that person to jail, or impose every type of financial sanction available to you. Fines, restitution, forfeiture of any ill-gotten gains, basically imprisonment or financial sanctions. You can't do both. Who votes to impose jail time to best achieve justice on the white-collar offender? Maybe 10, 11, 12? All right, who votes for financial sanctions? The majority. Well, it's fascinating. If you want to get into it later on, I was in Texas last week, in California 2 weeks before that, and Boston last month, and it's interesting. There is variations. The Midwest does have, I think, an anchor in certain of these areas, but that's not why we're here today. As I said, the issue for me is, as a society, what do we do about crime and economic or white-collar crime in particular, and the underpinnings that lead to it. It was about 8 years ago I was in court, and I had been prosecuting white-collar crime almost exclusively for like the prior 10 to 12 years. And I realized when I saw another person come through the system who I prosecuted like 10 years ago, I could do this to the day that I pass away. I'd be very much fulfilled in my job. I think being a federal prosecutor is one of the best jobs in the world. Certainly for a lawyer it is. I'd be able to bring justice to individual victims and the people who were involved in my cases, but I began to ask, at the end of that time, will my community be a better place? How much of an impact will I have made just in court? And I just vowed at that point forward I was going to do more than just trying to seek long jail terms, long prison terms for the people I prosecuted. I was going to try and seek innovative ways to achieve justice and make our community a safer and a better place. And if you want to get into some of that, there's a whole range of things that I did, from having corporations and individual defendants take out advertisements in the paper describing their crimes, because I'd heard so many people say, I didn't realize this was a federal offense. I didn't realize that you could get prosecuted for this. And I did that for a number of years, and I thought that was going in the right direction. I then approached somebody who I was prosecuting. He actually had been sentenced, and he was cooperating with us. He was being brought down from the prison camp in Duluth about appearing in public. He used to teach at St. Thomas and at Carlson in the business school. And this was a well-known investor. George Klein was his name. I don't know how many of you recognize him, but he was a very important investor in Minnesota. He was involved in starting over 100 Minnesota companies during his career. He sat on the board of directors of 40 companies. I asked George Klein to come and speak in public about why he had gotten involved in insider trading. And we had so many people show up at St. Thomas, they had to move it down the street to the First Baptist Church. We had 300 people show up and listen to George Klein speak about some of the same things you're going to hear about today. So that started a program that I now have got, as you heard, in terms of the numbers, more invitations than I can accept. But I do think it is, and you'll be the judge of that today, it is a unique way to talk and learn about business ethics. The third thing I did was I was responsible for cases involving a lot of fines, forfeitures. Midwest Federal was one of our savings and loans back in the late 80s. I prosecuted chairman of Midwest Federal and most of the senior executives there, and we had a huge forfeiture verdict from the jury. The jury sat through a 6-month trial and then basically took every dime from the defendants that they could legally take by way of forfeiture, and that all went to Washington, D.C., even though we had a lot of Minnesota victims, and it took years. It took years for us to get some of that money back here in Minnesota to the victims who had been defrauded. I had, in the Klein case, $10 million went to Washington, D.C., into the Treasury, and by way of forfeiture and the like, and then along came the Pipestone case that you're going to hear about, and you're going to hear about it from 2 different perspectives, which I think is, again, a rare opportunity for you, from the government side, from the prosecutor, but also from one of the defendants, one of the persons who was on the receiving end of the justice efforts that we pursued. And again, if you want to get into that, there are lots of issues involving what we later came to call extraordinary restitution. And Pipestone was just the first case, but I did it in over a dozen cases here in Minnesota, where we had money stay in Minnesota as opposed to going to Washington, D.C. I know I'm being taped, but I'm no longer a Justice Department employee. Folks in Washington, D.C. didn't like that too much. And ultimately, it was about six months ago, the Department of Justice, other districts started doing it around the country. This caught on. Judges in particular liked it. But the Department of Justice earlier this year issued an edict, no more extraordinary restitution negotiated by prosecutors. Judges could do it on their own, but the government wanted the money to come to Washington, D.C. So that's just by way of background where we're at. Pipestone's an amazing, complex case that we don't want to get bogged down too much into detail today, but we want you to appreciate what happened. So we have that one-page chronology of key events. Let me just give you a snapshot if you haven't had a chance to look at that. In 2001, I had just finished the Klein case, and I was approached by the U.S. Attorney. There had been a case in the office for a number of years. No charges had been brought. The FBI was very frustrated. The Office of Comptroller of the Currency, one of the federal bank regulating agencies in Washington, D.C., was even more frustrated. And they said, get this case resolved. So I met with the agent, and we laid out a blueprint of what we would do. It was an unusual case in several respects. The first is, it was opened up as a bank fraud investigation. The bank regulators, you're going to hear about the inside story from Dave Logan, came in and essentially shut down the bank, kicked out the president, and brought in all sorts of accountants and auditors and tried to figure out what the financial status of the bank was. At the end of all that work, it appeared to me, and this was like 4, maybe almost 5 years, well, at least 4 years later, there wasn't going to be a loss to the federal government. The Treasury was not going to have to pay out money, which is not very typical in a bank fraud case. Essentially, and Dave Logan and I disagree about some of this to this day, a lot of laws have been broken, regulations have been flouted, false documents have been prepared, false certifications have been submitted, loans have been made on false pretenses, but, as happens sometimes with wrongful behavior, a huge gamble had paid off because the businesses that were acquired and funded through this wrongful conduct succeeded. And I said to my FBI agent, you know, under the guidelines, which is how federal criminal cases work, this is a multi-million-dollar fraud case. And that's how the court's going to have to look at it. But restitution doesn't look like it's going to be necessary here. Some people got very wealthy from all of this wrongful conduct, which is a real issue for the government. But nobody's going to lose. At least that's not the way it looked to me. He said to me, well, the thing that's bothered me, Mr. Shea, for years is that on top of all the bank fraud, there are allegations, opinions, rumors, in some cases, confidential informants coming forward and saying the real crimes here are not what happened with this bank and this new company, but have been going on for a long time. Public corruption. The hook was that we had a county feedlot officer in southwestern Minnesota who doubles as the county environmental officer, who had gotten preferential loans from this bank we had under investigation. And then, as you're going to hear, the former bank president, who had gotten kicked out, through his attorney, had been cooperating, quote unquote, with the investigation before I got involved. That is, providing information about wrongdoing of others to try and obtain a more lenient sentence, a traditional investigative tool of the government. And one of the things that he had mentioned in the report was that this feedlot officer who got these preferential loans wasn't able to pay it back. In fact, he'd gotten some of the loans without any collateral at all. And the bank regulators were coming shortly before everything hit the fan. So what happened, according to the former president, was that cash was placed in a paper bag, and on 3 occasions it was delivered to the feedlot officer to pay off the loans. Well, to me, that was the key. Preferential loans, much like we're going to hear about down in Illinois in the weeks to come here, usually wrong, but whether it's criminal or not is another matter. But when you go to a secluded spot and bring a paper bag of U.S. currency to pay off the loans to a prosecutor, that is a red flag. And I said, I think to me that sounds like they're paying this guy off. He's responsible for regulating and ensuring the environmental safety of the feedlots that underpin this whole company. So, you'll hear more about that, but there were also, as I said, allegations, and that's all they were, that this had been going on before. And then I learned pretty early in the investigation that there were at least 5 people that were under investigation at that point, but one of them, Dave Logan, had actually worn 2 hats as well. And that's what I think we need to focus on today. He had been the CEO, and was the CEO when I took over the investigation of the company that was in operation, that had been built up with these improper and fraudulent loans. But before then, much earlier, he had been the city administrator of Pipestone. And that's where these allegations had just sort of sat on the table. So Dave is going to tell you the story from the inside. And it really is something that I've heard a number of times now. Each time I hear it, I think I learn something more about Dave Logan, and I think he maybe feels the same way about me. I think each time I feel a little bit more willing to share parts of the investigation that was going on in our end of it with him, and we both can benefit from that. But I'll let him tell the story in his words. There's just 3 things I ask you to focus on. I think that they are all connected with how I started out my talk. Why it's important to every one of us, no matter what your backgrounds are, no matter what your jobs are or are going to be. And the first is, it sounds almost like I'm a lawyer recruiting business, and I'm not, but it's difficult, I think, for MBA students or even for business owners to appreciate how critical a lawyer can be in their lives, in their futures, in times where you need to get a straight answer. You need to get solid advice because you have to make important decisions for yourself or for your organization. And I think there's no area more than the criminal law where that's the case. Because most MBA students don't take criminal law courses. And certainly most business owners don't have any background in criminal investigations or prosecutions or the consequences of when the government comes calling. And this case is one of the best examples I use for law students as to how crucial that lawyer can be. Dave Logan had 2 lawyers. And I don't know how much he wants to get into this today or how much you want to hear about it, but the first lawyer was a big name lawyer from Denver, Colorado, worked for a national law firm. Our office had had some experience with this lawyer years earlier. I had not. I never met or talked to him. But let's just say our relationship started off poorly and got worse. And that's happened to me during my career. It's unfortunate, but I deal with it. It's not the other lawyer that I got to be working with resolving. It's the person who engaged in the wrongful conduct. It led to very difficult plea negotiations. It led to even more difficult time when he came in for the first time to face the judge who was going to impose a sentence on him. And I don't know, again, how much you want to get into the nitty-gritty. Law students love to hear this stuff, but it was the most difficult plea in my 20 years for a defendant, not for me, not for my FBI agent who was sitting there furiously taking notes as Dave told us about crimes that we didn't even know about because of the way his lawyer had acted and set this thing up. And it made a very poor impression in front of the judge about Dave Logan. And it led to an even more difficult sentencing. When he came back, and for the second time in his life, he met this judge who's going to determine his future. And for only the second time in my career, the judge imposed a harsher sentence on Dave Logan than I asked for. I was not known as a timid prosecutor. And I remember saying to the judge, this is a harsh sentence that we've negotiated, and the judge disagreed with me and said, no, I don't think it's harsh enough. And imposed about one of the longer sentences that I've seen imposed on somebody who pled guilty, who did not contest the charges, who did not take the United States and force them to go to trial. And again, if you want to get into that, but the lawyer was so crucial because the second lawyer Dave hired, who was a Minneapolis lawyer, who I had dealt with on many cases, came in and tried to save the day, and I think he did everything he could for Dave Logan. But that world of difference between who you rely on. And I've learned now, after the fact, that many things I told that first lawyer were never communicated to his client. And that is indefensible, because Dave Logan's future, his liberty, was at stake. And it's a great example for law students. The second thing that I throw out to you is, what do you do about crimes? And they happen in Minnesota as much as they happen in other jurisdictions. Anybody who thinks that we don't have public corruption here, maybe not in Rochester, but we've convicted 3 city council people in Minneapolis in the last 4.5 years of bribery and other federal offenses. We do have public corruption. We have environmental offenses here. I've been involved in a number of those cases. When there's an environmental crime or a public corruption crime, who are the victims? My argument has been for years, everybody that lives in that area who's been affected in any way is a victim. And that's what we had on Pipestone. We had public corruption. A lot of it we could not define. Some of it was so old we could not determine how much the community had lost. But with the judge's blessing and encouragement, I ended up contacting the superintendent of schools, the new city manager, the county manager, saying, what were the things you needed in your community over the last few years that the budget wasn't there for? What do you need for your population in general? In the Pipestone case, the first person who came in is Bill Winter, a retired construction guy. I think he had done very, very well because of unlawful activity. We could never quantify it. But he ended up buying a new tornado warning siren system for Pipestone. The old system was so antiquated people couldn't even hear it. Out in western Minnesota, that's a big deal. He contributed for repairing the roof of the senior citizens home in Pipestone. He put money into buying some computers for the local grade school. And that started the ball rolling, where another defendant ended up buying a fire truck for the city. Rather than have to have the city go and lease the truck for the next 7 years and end up with no fire truck, this defendant bought a fire truck for the city as part of his criminal punishment. Computer servers and other computers were bought for 2 other schools during this. And a whole host of environmental efforts were undertaken, mostly with Dave Logan's money, to address whether or not this feedlot officer had put at risk anybody living in Pipestone or Rock County because of his behavior. That, as I said, at the outset, was called extraordinary restitution, and there's a lot that followed from that. The third thing I'd like you to think about, and this is something that's really important to me now as a law school professor, is how we punish people. How we punish people who break our laws, particularly white-collar offenses. And Dave's experience can speak directly to that. That's that third question I asked you. We have some real pressing issues as a state regarding our budget, but we are not nearly in the same difficulty as some other states. 5 states now, including Michigan, are spending more money, more taxpayer dollars on prison management than they are in higher education. And I submit to you that that is a recipe for disaster for those states and for their futures. If the trends continue, it will be 10 states in the next 5 years, including possibly California. We need to start thinking as a society different about how we punish people, because what we're doing right now, I would suggest, is simply not working. And Dave Logan has some ideas about that. I brought him to my crime and punishment class. I brought in other people, including judges and probation officers as well. Everybody thinks the system is broke. I mean, it is a system that is only going to get more difficult for us as these economic times continue to erode. And we need to stand up and do something about it. And we need to do that as a community. The final thing, you know, the statistics you hear every morning now about Wall Street and our state budget are disturbing to the max. But the statistics that came out last week, which got fairly short shrift, were just as troubling to me. There's a biannual survey done of high school students all throughout the country. It's done out of California. 30,000 high school students, Minnesota students are included. It's all 50 states, private school, parochial school, public school. It's the largest survey of what is the ethical pulse of our next generation. 2 years ago, and I've used this statistic for the last 2 years, 60% of the high school students said they had cheated on an exam in the prior year in high school. The results that came out last week for 2008, 64%. For the first time I've seen this, business owners are really troubled by the fact they asked students in high school how many had stolen from a store in the prior year. 30% said they had stolen from a store. MBA students, and I know if you've already studied this, Steve, if you brought this out, McCabe and Trevino, Butterfield do a survey they did. 5,000 MBA students were surveyed in 2006. They were asked how many had cheated in the prior year. Have you guys seen this already? 54%. And I bring that statistic out of law schools and I say law students did better and law students kind of sit up a little bit and all that. Only 46% of law students said they cheated in the prior year. To me, that is as difficult to deal with as these catastrophic economic numbers, because that is our future, our business leaders, our professionals, the people who are going to be in our workforce. And that's what today is all about. So without any further background, let me ask Dave to come up, tell his story, and I'll refrain from kibitzing him too much during the story, but then we'll open up for questions and answers, and you'll maybe see some of these issues are not black and white. Dave?
Thank you, Nick. I'd like to say thank you to Steve for inviting me again to come to his class and to talk with you. Very pleased also to see that there's probably a number of people who aren't in the class, because I think you said there's only 16 or something, so many of you are not in the class, and glad that you were able to come as well. I come before you to speak to you not in any way being pleased with myself or proud to be here in terms of what I'm going to talk to you about. Steve was kind enough to say that he thought that I spoke articulately at the prison, but I know you're never supposed to say this when you're a speaker, but I'm a pig farmer, so I'm not really a speaker. So articulate was a very nice word, but I hope that I can do my best to convey to you some of the experiences that I had, and that's all that I'm here to do. I'm not here to preach, proselytize. I'm not here to try to tell you something that you should do that you probably already know anyway, but maybe as I tell you my story, you might pick something out of it that could be helpful to you either now or sometime in the future. Because I think I probably look a lot like everybody here. I mean, if I was to go out there and sit in the audience someplace and then you brought someone in and said, okay, now I want you to pick out the felon in the room. They might point at me, but they might point at you, or you. So I look a lot like everybody else, and I think that's kind of important. It's a point, I guess, that I want you to think about as I talk. What I did is possible to happen to anyone, to somebody that looks like and acts like regular, typical people, but has a character flaw that resulted in a terrible situation occurring, both for myself, but as well, more than for myself, for my family, for my friends, for my business partners, for many other people that were affected, that I feel way worse for than I do for myself. I'll just tell you just a little bit about myself and my background, and then I'll tell a little bit about what happened from my perspective of it. I think Mr. Shea and I agree mostly on what happened, but not entirely. And there is a tendency, and I want to make sure that this doesn't happen either. There's a tendency, I think, to want to convey things in such a way that you're still sort of defending yourself, kind of. You know, I mean, I think that sort of never goes away, to be honest with you, when you've gone through what I went through. If that seems to be the way that, if some things I say seem to be that way, please don't take them that way, because I want to tell you that as I stand here today, I accept full responsibility for all the things that I did that were wrong. You know, while there are some things that I think that I did that I didn't realize were as wrong as other things, nonetheless they were, and I certainly was a great party to the criminal acts that occurred both at the city level as well as later on with the business. Well, I was born in 1947, had a family that was much like every other family in my neighborhood. I lived in Richfield, which is southern Minneapolis, south suburb of Minneapolis. Had a younger brother and a younger sister. My dad went to work every day. My mom stayed home, just like most of the moms did back then. Nothing was too unusual about my young life. I had lots of friends around the neighborhood because we were all kind of the same age. Lived in a very small, modest home, just like all the other homes in the neighborhood. I got a job as a paper boy when I was 11 years old. I was able to be hired at that age. They usually hired 12-year-olds, but they needed a kid because some guy quit the route, and they were just stuck with it. So I was trying to get a job there, so they hired me at a young age. And since I was 11, I never really went a day without a job in my life until I arrived at Duluth Federal Prison Camp in August of 2002. After I got out of high school in 1965, I went to the University of Minnesota for a couple of quarters. Went to then transferred to KU for 2 years because my folks had moved down to Kansas City after I graduated from high school. And I finished up at Bemidji State College, where I graduated in 1970. After I graduated, I went to the Army and took basic training in Fort Jackson. And luckily enough, back then when the Vietnam War was going on, I was in the National Guard, so I was able to get out of going to Vietnam. And when I came back, I took a job, oddly enough, as a probation officer in Kansas City, and worked with mostly minority young kids, juvenile delinquent types. It was a very interesting job. I'd gone, when I graduated from college, I was graduated in sociology and psychology. And so that's why it was sort of my nature is to try to get into that sort of business. And so when I got the job, I was a little bit apprehensive, but as I got to know these young kids, I really enjoyed them, and they were really pretty decent kids, even though, I mean, to say that sounds weird because, for instance, I remember this one kid in particular, I really liked him. He was like about maybe 10 or 11 years old or something, and he was, you know, he'd been involved in armed robbery. But, you know, he was with his older brother, and they were stuck up with 7-Eleven, and, you know, it was just kind of the way it was there. And so, you know, he wasn't a bad kid. He just was a kid that just didn't have any chances. You know, he didn't have an opportunity. So I used to, you know, I learned to like these kids. I was there for a little less than a year and got an opportunity to come back to Minnesota, which is really where I wanted to come back to, because that's where my roots were from. And worked at Marshall, Minnesota, in Lyon County for the welfare department there as a volunteer services coordinator. About 3 years later, I got a job in Pipestone as the welfare director there, and I worked there for several years, and it was then got divorced, and I moved to Kansas City for a short time until I realized that was a big mistake because my young daughter was still in Pipestone. So I just came back to Pipestone and was fortunate enough to get a job working for the city, where I started as a community development director, and later on was promoted to the city administrator, which of course Mr. Shea has alluded to here. Worked for the city for about 15 years. And I'm going to say a little bit about some of the things that happened there after I give you just a little bit more background on how I actually got charged with what I got charged with. After about 15 years with the city, I was kind of looking for something different. You know, it's a small town. about 5,000 people. You know, you think you're doing big things sometimes because you get some big project going, it's an economic development project or an infrastructure project or something, and you sort of start to feel kind of proud about what you're doing, and then you go out to supper and you run into somebody and they give you a horrible time because their garbage didn't get picked up on time or something, or the guy tipped over the can when he left, or they called about the pothole and nobody ever did anything, or things like that. So after a while, it sort of gets to you in a smaller town because you can't really get away from it very easy. So I looked for an opportunity to do something different, and that did come up in the fact that there was a guy who was moving away. He was a doctor, and he owned a large hog operation. And it was moving to Lindstrom, Minnesota, and so he wanted to sell this thing. Well, I had a friend who was a veterinarian by the name of Dr. Gordon Sprunk. He had another friend who was a banker by the name of Mike Morgan. And with those two guys, when I found out about this opportunity, we ended up putting a deal together where we were partners, and we bought this business from this fellow and started into the hog business. I didn't know anything about pigs at the time. As a matter of fact, I remember one time somebody asked me to come and speak at something or other shortly after I got involved in this thing, and I was to tell about what I was doing in the hog. It was like the Kiwanis or something like that. And I remember I wrote little notes on the inside of my hand so I could remember what the different things were called. You know, the barrows were the boys and the gilts were the girls, and you know, so as I said, I wasn't I wasn't a farm kid. I was a city kid, but this was what I thought to be was a good opportunity, good business. It was a large operation at the time, about 1,200 sows, produced about 30,000 pigs a year, and I thought that was a big deal, and it was a big deal for our area. So my job was I thought, boy, if I ever got a good team put together here, I got the veterinarian in case the pigs are sick, which of course that always happens. Got a banker in case we need any money. One of the guys had a 10% ownership, Jerry Bauman. He actually was the guy who was running the operation for this fellow that sold it to us. And so my job was then to just sort of do the business aspects of it and try to make the business grow and expand. In the 1990s, the swine business was in sort of this huge curve that was going like this. You had to get big fast or you were going to be left out in the cold. So people were spending enormous amounts of money on capital investment in order to get into that curve so that they weren't going to get left behind. So all these guys in Iowa and southern Minnesota, over in Fairmont County, out in our part of the state, the small guys were getting out because the guys that had 100 sows or 50 sows or something like that, they just couldn't compete with these larger, more economically operated operations. Sort of economies of scale. I mean, stuff that you guys that are in the MBA class knew, way before I even thought about that stuff. So it's very simple business. But in the case of what was going on, you needed a huge amount of capital. Well, I didn't think we were going to be able to buy the business because I didn't have any money to speak of, let alone grow and expand. But through the bank, we were able to do some of these things. And I thought to myself, how fortunate I am to be hooked up with this guy who owns a bank. I mean, after all, he's got actually there's a vault there that was, had a lot of money in it. And so, I thought, well, we could get some and use it for our business. And so we did. We expanded just like everybody else did at the time, as fast as we could, and it took a lot of money. In doing that, however, we ran into several problems with the bank. One of them, not the least of which, was things like lending limits and concentrations of credit, and how do we borrow enough money to establish basis into the company so that we can benefit from all the huge deductions that were occurring as a result of rapid depreciation with the facilities we were building. And you could depreciate the sows. It's a really good deal from a tax standpoint. As long as you could shelter, as long as you got income to shelter. Well, all those issues we sort of had to maneuver our way through, and to be quite candid, I probably, and I don't mean to say this in any kind of braggadocious way or anything like that, but I probably was the one who had to figure most of this stuff out, because the other guys, the veterinarian, while he was certainly an intelligent fellow, wasn't really interested in that kind of stuff, and he was sort of along for the ride, as it turned out later on. The banker just didn't really have the creativity to come up with the ideas. So we created some fictitious companies, we did nominee loans, we did SBA loans because they didn't count against the lending limit. But in the SBA loans, we sometimes were saying we were going to build this over here, but really the good share of the money went for this over here, and all that sort of thing. Now, of course, all those things were wrong. They seemed expedient at the time. They didn't seem that bad at the time, because our intention was certainly not to not pay the loans back, and it wasn't to take the money and go on a big trip or something like that, or buy a fancy plane, or big house or something of that nature. It was to invest in the business. But they, nonetheless, I mean, there's no doubt about it, they were not, they were misrepresented. And of course, the potential of the bank being at risk was always there, just like in any loan. We always kind of joked and said that this is, that bank was referred to for many, many years as the Morgan Bank in Pipestone. It was the First National Bank of Pipestone, but the Morgans had involvement and ownership in it for nearly 100 years, so it was referred to as the Morgan Bank. And we always joked and said there were sort of three moments in a Morgan's life that were really important moments that something had to be done. One was April 15th, one was December 31st, and one was the day before the bank examiners was coming. And every time the bank examiners came, I sensed that Mike was sort of in a very disconcerted state, and nervous, and wondering, was everything going to go okay? And they stayed down at the bank late, and which was very atypical, and worked on getting all the stuff done that they had to get done so that they could present the best images they could to the examiners. Well, this one day, one time the bank examiners came, I noticed that Mike didn't seem to be very worried, and I was perplexed about that, because I thought, that's odd. Usually he's just paranoid that something's going to go wrong, and he seemed to be very at peace. So I thought, well, that's good. Everything must be fine. And so I didn't think much more of it, and just went about my business, and went to Sioux Falls to get something for the company. And I came back, and I stopped at the house on the way back, and as I drove by down the street, because he lived about a block and a half away from me, I saw his pickup truck was in the driveway, and it was like 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the afternoon, something like that. I thought that was a little odd, particularly with the examiners there. But I thought, he's a banker. He owns the bank, so, who knows, Anyway, I didn't think any more of it, went to the office. Get there, hardly sit down. Kathy buzzes me, the secretary, and she says, Dave, Mike's on the phone. Okay. Had somebody waiting for me, but I took the call. Mike, what's up? Well, he says, can you come over to the house? And I said, yeah, I can, Mike. I got a guy here, and, it won't be that long. I'll be over, it shouldn't take more than half an hour or something like that. He says, Dave, can you come right now? I said, okay. So I hung up the phone, and I told the guy, sorry, I can't see you. I got my truck, ran over to Mike's house. I walk in the door. His wife's sitting at the kitchen table. She's crying. I said, Mike, what happened? What's wrong? I thought, kids, or, he's had 5 kids. I thought, what happened? He said, well, I had to leave the bank. And of course, I'm not connecting dots yet. So I said, okay, okay. What do you mean? You had to come home? Well, he said, no, they told me I had to leave the bank. I said, who told you you had to leave the bank? Well, the examiners did. I said, well, why? Well, we got some problems. They found out that I was kind of involved with Global. That was the name of our company. I said, well, okay, let's clear them up, and when can you go back? He says, never. Well, of course, now I'm thinking about sitting down with the wife and crying. So, because I knew at that moment that life as we had known it was now over. And a huge change came over. Well, anyway, we talked for a little while, and I said, well, gee, Mike, maybe you could come to work for Global. And I said, if you want it, you could be the president. I don't want to be the president. Maybe it'll look kind of good to the community. You were the president of the bank, now you're the president of this expanding hog company. And yeah, he says, maybe that would be all right. I said, well, then kind of had this sort of like, long pause, and I said, well, what do you think's going to happen? He said, well, I don't know, I'm kind of worried. And I said, well, do you think you're in like real trouble? And he said, well, I think I could be. So I said to him, I always wonder about this. I said, well, Mike, why don't you just blame it all on me? There's nothing they can do to me. And I think it sort of made sense to him, because afterwards that's what I think he did with the government. And of course the thing about it is with the government is once I think that they find that once the other attorneys, if there's a group of defendants, and I mean this happens, you're reading cases in the paper right now that are going to be just like this. Once the other attorneys sense that that's the guy they're after, then they can get their clients to say, I hardly knew what was going on. I mean, he did it. I don't know. I wasn't. And that's how that stuff goes. Well, it's easy to do that, and of course, then all of a sudden the finger gets pointed at one person. Not at all to say that I, of course, didn't have a lot to do with it, but it's always peculiar how everybody sort of forgets about how anything happened before, and of course the fact that they were a beneficiary of it, they sort of forget about that part too. In any case, Mike, came to work at Global for a while, and of course things just sort of went from bad to worse. This was in 1998. We started business in 1993. This was the summer of '98. For the next, up until then, from then until August of 2002, things just took a spiral down. It was very, very difficult. The government, of course, as Mr. Shea has explained, started coming after us. Every time they seemed to come back with another round of stuff that made the deal worse, that they found more problems, they found more criminal activity and all that sort of thing, so it just got worse and worse. The effect that it has on a person's life is enormous. I consider that to be the beginning of my punishment, even before I ever got near the prison or even thought about the prison, because you begin to worry and to fret and to agonize over all the things that you think might happen to you, thinking the worst, which, as it turned out, I was right about thinking the worst. Obviously, it could have been worse. Like Garrison Keillor always says, the Minnesotans, it could have been worse. Well, it could have, but it was bad enough, let me tell you. So the effects that it has on your life and your family situation and all that kind of stuff is just horrible. Believe me, if you would ever equate what you thought you might have gained on this side with what you lost on this side, it's not even a contest. The point that you might think to yourself, maybe I'll get away with this, or maybe no one will know, or something like that. Well, believe me, they'll probably find out somehow. About the time you think that happens, you get blindsided from a place you never even think of. Briefly, the way we got caught, or the way this started out, was that Mike had hired a guy by the name of Rick Stevens who went to work at the bank. He had a falling out with the Morgans. He ended up in a bank someplace else, like St. Cloud or something like that. The examiners came by there where he was at the new bank, and of course he said to him when he had an opportunity, well, obviously they interview all the different people in the bank, and loan officers and so on, and he said, if I was you guys, when I was down in Pipestone, I think I'd look into this. And he told him a little bit about Mike and Mike's activity with our business and so on and so forth, and of course that's against the banking regulations, which me and the other partners didn't quite understand, but nonetheless it was against the banking regulations, and we probably should have understood it or learned about it. Mr. Shea makes the point that it's easy to have things happen that you don't know about and get you in trouble, and of course when you're in a little bit of trouble with somebody, it's easy to get into a lot of trouble with them because you then become a conspirator, and unless you can really show that you had nothing to do with something else, you become sort of responsible for everything else that they did too, and they become responsible for everything you did. So it's a very, very bad situation. Let me segue, Jim, just briefly to the city stuff. I had always, you know, it bothered me, and Mr. Shea has mentioned to you that you know, nobody lost any money in this deal. And so it always bothered me, thinking to myself, you know, how can I be getting in this much trouble? How can I be having this much difficulty with these plea negotiations when really, you know, nothing real bad happened? The bank didn't lose any money. We paid all of our loans off. We paid everything on time. We paid all the interest we were supposed to pay, and all that stuff. Seemed like you couldn't get in this much trouble. Well, the fact of the matter was, as this investigation was going along, they were looking at the stuff that I'd done with the city. That, you know, while I could probably sit here and kind of, you know, if we ever were to do something like this, Mr. Shea and I could sort of debate a little bit about some of these bank issues. Well, I can sort of somehow justify some of them, and I can put a little different spin on it. Oh, geez, I thought I was going to turn that on. Put a little different spin on it. You know, there is no spin I can put on the things that took place with the city of Pipestone. Just plain wrong. While I was there, I wore several hats. I was the community development director, I was the city administrator, I was the housing and redevelopment authority director, I was the economic development director, and I was kind of all of those things at one time. It is absolutely no excuse, but it is easy to start to think to yourself, well, gee whiz, I know guys in other towns, you know, not too much different than our size town, and they got, instead of having one guy doing all this, they got 3 or 4 people doing it. And I'm doing all this stuff here, and gosh, I'm putting, you know, lots of hours in, I'm here nights and working on weekends, all that sort of thing. You start to say to yourself, you start to justify in your mind, I should get something extra for what I'm doing. But, you know, the town's only going to put up with paying you so much money, and people aren't going to, I mean, you just can't, you know, you can't say, well, gee, Dave's doing 3 jobs, and so, you know, we should give him 3 times the pay or something. That's not going to happen in a small town. So you start to say to yourself, well, how can I get something extra? And pretty soon an opportunity presents itself. If you're looking for that opportunity, an opportunity presents itself where you can find somebody who you can make a deal with, who will give you something for preferential treatment with regard to a contract or to some other payment things that the city's doing or something. Well, Mr. Shea mentioned Bill Winter. Just worked out perfect that it was a guy named Winter, because when we opened bids, I could open them alphabetically. And since W is at the end of the alphabet, all the time, we were able to read his bid last, and if there was an opportunity, I could adjust what his bid was. Now, sometimes that resulted in the city getting the work done for less, because I knew in my mind, because of previous conversations we'd had, that if somebody else's bid was $100 and his bid was $102, that really he'd do it for 98. So if I read 98, that'd be okay. So in that case, actually the city got the work done and it was cheaper. Now, it cheated the other contractors, but you know, the public didn't get hurt. Now, on other occasions, however, I sort of kind of thought about this, and I kind of morphed into the thought about, well, what about when he leave, you know, as you guys probably are aware, the terminology contractors might use, left money on the table. What about when he left money on the table? So what about, you know, what about that? Well, then I thought to myself, I could read a bigger number than what, because he was the low bid, but between him and the next guy was quite a bit of room. So I could read a bigger number, and then he could still get the job, but he'd make more money. Well, then, you know, the other contractors weren't cheated, but you cheated the public, because they paid more for something than they otherwise would have had to pay. So that practice went on for a long time, and it involved mostly just several people, but because you know, it isn't something you do with everybody, or you have to be very careful about it. And I thought that I was smart enough to cover my tracks, and I think that once you get to thinking that, you you can get yourself in a lot of trouble. All you in this room, certainly those of you that are MBA students, and I'm sure looking out in the audience here, I can say that this would be the case for almost everyone sitting out there that I can see, and that is that you're all very bright people, and you're, I'm sure, very successful at what you're doing, and all that sort of thing. But there's a potential downside to that if you start to think to yourself that you're so smart that you can get away with something. And I began to think that. And so when you get arrogant, and you are, you do have a little bit of brains, once you get that formula mixed up with people who are willing to play that same game with you, it's a very, very dangerous situation. And you start down in a little way first, and then in a little bigger way, and then in a little bigger way, and start down this slippery slope that takes you to a situation where all of a sudden you've lost the moral fiber that you thought you had, and the character that you thought you had, and you've given it up in exchange for, really, to be honest, measly old money. And that's always what it comes down to. It always comes down to money, and what a huge, huge mistake that is. Well, as I found, the government was, I think, more perturbed about the city of Pipestone activities than they were about the banking activities, but that's how they could get to me, was the banking stuff. And then this John Berger's deal that he described with the, it wasn't always a paper bag, sometimes it was a plastic bag, but anyway, it's pretty close, But in any case, that was what the worst thing was. And of course, as I said, that was an indefensible sort of thing, and it's something that I will regret forever. Let me just conclude very briefly by saying, and then you'll be the first one to get the question in because you raised your hand first. Let me just briefly conclude by saying this. The effect that this has on a person is enormous, and the effect that it has on others is just as enormous. If you think when you do something that you're just going to, if there's any downside, you're just going to hurt yourself, believe me, unless you don't have any friends, and you don't have any family, and you don't have any other business acquaintances, you're going to hurt everybody. So, and a lot of people that you didn't mean to hurt. So in my case, I was, believe it or not, when I got to prison on August 9th of 2002, I was actually, even though it was a horrible day because I felt terrible for my wife when she dropped me off, I was actually relieved because it was kind of over. All this, I don't know what's going to happen now, how much worse can it get, what's he going to come up with next, all that stuff was finally over. I was just going to go do my time and get the heck out of there. And in the meantime, between in those prior 4 years, I was eating too much, I was smoking too much, I was drinking too much, I was working too much, I was worrying too much. I mean, I was a physical and mental wreck. And actually, when I finally got into prison, I was able to fix a lot of that stuff because I was, you get the, you can kind of once you can deal with it, then the emotion part is over with. I got, I took up, running and weightlifting, and not like Charles Atlas type weightlifting, but just weightlifting and that sort of thing to be able to get back into good physical shape. And frankly, to tell you the truth, I mean, I could make an argument, I suppose, that going to prison for a while might have saved my life and maybe extended my life by developing better habits than I had before. So, but having said that, the way that happened with my family, what happened to them and what happened to my friends and so on was awful, because they all stuck with me and they stuck up for me. I was very, very lucky. Most people, most white collar guys that I saw there, they lost their job, of course. They lost all their money, whatever money they might have had. They lost their marriage. Well, many of them lost their kids. The kids wouldn't come anymore because they blamed the dad for what the mom had to live with. They lost their friends. They had a business. They lost their business. They lost everything. And I worked with a guy one time at the National Guard Armory when I was there. That when he got out, and this is while we went off the compound and went to work at the armory, and then came back in the afternoon. Anyway, when this guy he was like 58 years old. When he left, he had absolutely nothing. Went to a halfway house there in Duluth because he didn't have any place else to go. Got a job. He got a job selling cars, so at least he had some job. But I mean, he lost his family. Nobody came to see him. I mean, it was awful. So it's a horrible thing. I never had any of that, so I count myself very, very fortunate in that regard. So my wife came to visit me every other weekend for 4 years, 8 months, and 2 days, just in case anybody was interested in counting. It was about a 600-mile round trip every time she came. I mean, it was very, very. Well, let me just say this, and since and again, I'm not trying to preach to anybody, but this is my story, so I'm telling it. Part of my experience there was to realize that there is more to life than just what happens to me. There's more to why things happen than just how it affects me. And I sensed that there was a spiritual realm to this whole thing too. So not only was there a physical improvement and an emotional and mental improvement, but there was a spiritual improvement too, to the point where sometimes you get torn down to the point where there's sort of nothing else that you can sort of hang your hat on. You can't say, well, I can do this, I can do that. You sort of run down to the point where there's just nothing left. And when you're in prison, you realize there's nothing you can do about nothing. I mean, you just can't do much of anything. Yeah, you can make phone calls, you can write letters, but you can't make anything happen anywhere. They make it happen, you don't make it happen. So I realized that something that became very important to me as I would read Proverbs every day, since it kind of works out good, there's 31 of them, so it sort of works out, you read one every day. And at the next month you can start over. As I read that, I committed to memory Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, which was trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not unto your own understanding, and acknowledge Him in all your ways, and He will direct your paths. And that became very important to me, and has set the tone for the time now that I have with my family since I'm out raising my chickens and the sheep and the cows. So. Anyway, having said all that, thank you, and hopefully we have plenty of time for questions. And whoever this gentleman is in the red sweatshirt back here gets the first one.
Well, thank you. It was a great presentation, Dave. I work for Vermont Food, so I understand colleagues a little bit. but one thing, so if I understand you correctly, if you the first time they decided to go after you for the global ventures, if you had come out clean right off the gate, you probably got into less trouble?
Oh, yeah. I should have, I told my lawyer at the time, I said, why don't, this is just short, as a matter of fact, before Mr. Shea got involved, there was a guy named Bill Michael who later resigned from the U.S. Attorney's Office and went to work in private practice. But I told my attorney, I said, Kevin, why don't we just go talk to these guys? And why don't I just tell them what happened? And I guess we'll sort of let the chips fall where they may. He said to me, well, Dave, if you want to do that, that's fine, but you're going to have to get a new attorney. I quit, because I'm not going to let my client go talk to the government. Well, in retrospect, I should have said, fine, just quit. But at that time, as Mr. Shea pointed out, when you get in a deal like this, I mean, it's like the Titanic is going down, and there's somebody's throwing out some sort of a life jacket or something. You grab onto anything that you grab onto, and your lawyer is what you grab onto. So if your lawyer says, do this, you do that.
I've told this to Dave, so he knows this, but when I first got the case, I've been doing this a fair number of years. I sat down with the FBI agent and I said, if they all come in right now, I think 36 to 41 months for Logan and Morgan, and he's the banker, and then less for everybody else, significantly less. So to give you an idea, you end up getting about twice the amount of time in prison a year later.
Because of the issues related to the city administrators?
Right. Go ahead.
I'm interested in Mr. Logan, your interactions with the contractor. I know you said when if you're looking for something like that, an opportunity might kind of come about. How did that happen? I guess that you're willing to share. Did he approach you or you approach him?
Tell them the first time. This is, I think, very instructive for all of us. Tell them the first time it happened, and if you want to go into other examples, but how did you step over the line?
This goes before. This is before winter now. I mean, I knew winter, but this is before that. Then I'm going to get back to I'll get to winter though, the contractor. We had a hotel in our town called the Calumet Hotel. It's set on the 100% corner of Pipesville. Pipesville's a little town, Main Street and Hiawatha. I mean, it was on that corner. And so, unfortunately, it was an old hotel. It had not been taken care of. It didn't have a very good clientele, if at all, any clientele. It ended up being kind of like a rooming house for people that didn't have, so anyway, you can picture it. It got closed down, boards on the windows, all that sort of thing. It's a 4-story Sioux Court site, beautiful building. And, the thought was, well, gee, maybe we should, people in town, some people said, well, maybe we should tear it down. Well, those of us who had some sort of feeling for historic preservation said, well, gee, maybe we could find somebody to fix it up instead of tear it down. And so we found some guys in Worthington who were willing to take a shot at that. This is a couple of young fellows, brothers. And we helped them by getting them grants, every grant we could think of that we tried to get. We got them loans through HUD. HUD even stretched their rules a little bit, nothing illegal, but they stretched their rules as far as they could because they thought it was a good project, they wanted to see it happen. And so anyway, one day these guys were at the city council meeting and we took a break. The city council took a break. So I was over, I don't exactly remember how come I was back by Caroline Severance's office, but anyway, but she was the water lady, the water collection lady. And so we were back kind of by where she was, and the other guys were standing outside the door. And Mike said to me, Dave, Greg and I, he was always very melodramatic about everything. He says, Greg and I have been talking, and we want to give you a truck. And I said, well, okay, yeah. Or what do you mean? He said, well, we just want to, we appreciate everything you've done for us. We want to give you a truck. And I said, well, okay, what kind of truck? Well, a semi. And I thought, well, gosh, I never had one of them before, so that's, sounded kind of like a neat idea. So I said, well, okay, what do you, I don't, he said, well, we just want to show you that, we appreciate what you've done, and we're going to put this in your name, and, it runs back and forth to California. Because they had like 6 or 8 trucks, and did haul stuff, And he said, well, when it gets paid off, then it'll be yours, and then, I said, well, yeah. I said, well, geez, that's really nice of you, Mike. Thanks a lot. And I got the truck. Well, that began my way of realizing that there were people who, when you did something for them, they would be willing to do something for you. As it turned out on the truck, it turned out to be a disaster. I ended up having to pay money to get, because the hotel went broke, the guys went bankrupt, the bank was seized by the FDIC. I was on the name of the loan for the truck. I didn't know where the truck was. I never saw the truck. And so I ended up having to pay for the truck. But that doesn't make any difference. I mean, the fact of the matter is I'd done something wrong by accepting it, and it began the thought process. So with Winter, it just so happens that his dad was on the city council. This Bill Winter. I'd known Bill for years. His dad was on the city council. His dad's passed away now, so I mean, it's sort of reluctant to say anything bad about somebody that's not here to defend themselves anymore. But old Bill came to me one day. His dad was Bill too, and he came to me and he said, Billy's having some real problems. He had a real bad job down in Texas, lost a lot of money, and he sure could use some help. And I said, well, okay, Bill. And, well, then anyway, then I talked to Billy about it and several times, and he said, well, I sure could use some help on getting jobs with the city, be sure help out get things back going again. So I want to get I can't get a bond, and but if I could get a few jobs and get under my belt and get going again, get the bond, and pretty soon one thing led to another. Well, then he's grateful too, and then once that started, well, then my brain started going, thinking to myself, well, there's a lot of other things we can do here too that would be, in terms of other development of the city and other things like that, as long as he's willing to, give me something and I can give him something, geez, we're both better off, and that's how it gets going. And it's a very easy thing to fall into once you start doing it. And again, if you're a little creative, it's even easier.
Yeah.
I was going to say, can you think of anything in your upbringing, in your schooling, in your relationship with your employer that would have prevented you from going down this path, or have changed your mindset? I mean, I know that might be not necessarily something specific, but as lots of students being here, are there things that we can look for or watch for, sort of these defining principles that we need to be aware of to say, this would have prevented this from happening? And then my second question was your wife aware of the activities that you were engaging? Because you talked about the closeness of your family. Was she aware of the?
Let me answer the second part first, and then answer because it's simple. Because the answer is no. So she wasn't. Going back to your other question, you know, I'm glad that you asked that because it sort of helps me get to one of the things I thought about on the way here, and that I've thought about a lot since I got out of prison, and that is that every day we have a lot of choices to make in a variety of ways. And I mean, I'm not talking about choices like, you know, to get a black coat or a brown coat, but choices that are significant choices. Should I do this? Should I do that? Things that could be, you know, either right or wrong to do. And some, of course, are very fuzzy. My upbringing was such that all the indications that you had looking at me growing up as a kid would never have led you to believe that I would have done something. I went to the Edina Baptist Church. I mean, I used to take a note to school that said, you know, please excuse David from square dancing class, or, you know, that kind of thing. You know, I couldn't dance, I couldn't smoke, I couldn't drink, I couldn't play cards, I couldn't go to movies. I mean, all that stuff. So I mean, you wouldn't think to yourself somebody with that kind of a moral upbringing would do this kind of thing that was wrong. But I tell you, there are people who have kind of potential character flaws, and unfortunately, they could fall into a character flaw. There are people like you guys, to some extent, and I say that not trying to point any fingers at anybody, but people who are aggressive, who do things, and you know, who can realize that there's a line and see the line, but think to themselves, I might be able to cross it a little bit. There was just a good example of how my makeup is. There was a warden that we had that when you walked a certain area, you walked on this one street, and he didn't want you walking in the middle of the street. He thought that looked bad. Of course, there's no traffic, but you know, he just didn't think it looked good. But so he wanted you to walk on the edge of the street. So he had this yellow line painted like here. So out here's the street, and here's the yellow line. I could not keep myself from walking in that line. I mean, I walked on the line, I walked 1 foot over here, 1 foot over here. I mean, it was very difficult for me to think to myself that some guy was going to draw a line and I had to stay on this side of it. And that's a bad, I mean, you have to really watch yourself if you have that kind of a makeup. Now, on the other hand, the reason I got what I got going was because when somebody needed something done, and the same with the city, when they needed something done, whether it was the city or my business later on, they would come to me and say, you know, we need to get this done. And then they felt like their job was over because they knew that somehow I would get it done by hook or by crook. Well, that's probably a bad choice of words. One way or the other. And I did. And so there's a good side to it, but there's a bad side to it too. The one thing that could have made a difference, I think, in my life, however, after having said all that stuff in answer to your question, is that if I had maybe somebody who was a close friend or associate who wasn't, who would have given me some better advice and had not been a sort of another culprit, you know, so to speak, it would have made a big difference. I didn't have that person. Now that's probably my fault for not going out and finding him, but I didn't have that person who watched over what I was doing and said, Dave, you know, you got to watch yourself here. I think you're doing something wrong. You better not cross that yellow line the guy drew on the ground.
I'm curious, how many do you have mentors already? Is that something that's fostered and really promoted here? Because I'm convinced that what Dave just talked about is absolutely the case. You know, every single law student who comes to St. Thomas now gets a mentor from the day they enter the school. It's either a practicing lawyer or a judge. And we have 450 mentors. There's now required courses that they take with those mentors in terms of experiences. That's how the law used to be taught a long time ago. But the more important piece of that is that they have a sounding board. They have somebody that we hope will be available to them while they're practicing. Because whether you're going to be a business executive or a professional, like Dave said, you are going to have probably on a daily basis ethical issues. And I know, you know, many of you are working now. You know that. they're not life or death, they're not federal criminal offenses or not, but they're questions of doing something right or doing something wrong. And you're not gonna wanna call your mentor or email your mentor about every one of those, but maybe once a month, you're gonna have something that really causes you to pause. And you recognize, this is something that's serious, I'm gonna go in one of two directions here. If you have somebody that you can contact and run it by and get some unvarnished advice, some wise counsel, because they've probably been in the position themselves earlier in their lives, it's worth its weight in gold. The second thing I'll say to you real quickly is the students ask me this all the time, from all walks of life. Well, give me something to take away from this, Mr. Shea. This is fine and well for Mr. Logan or whoever, but what can I use as a tool? And I mean, it's really simple, I think, when you get to the ethical decisions. I mean, taking the truck or not. I mean, it's the light of day test. If whatever you decide to do is on the front page of the paper or on the internet the next morning, can you live with it? Can you explain it? Now, people might disagree with the choice you made. A lot of times these gray issues are not necessarily a right, wrong. It could be one is more right than the other, but they're both right, but somebody's going to get hurt. Those are the tough business calls. When someone's going to suffer, but either decision can be categorized as right, what do you do? If whatever choice you make is on the front page of the paper and your kids see it, or your spouse sees it, or your parents see it, can you live with it? 99.9% of the time, you are going to be okay. You are going to be just fine. People might disagree with the decision you made, but it won't be the type of thing that you covered up, whether you said, I hope my spouse never finds out about this. Sir?
Question for you, David. In regards to, I'm from a small community, and there was actually a white-collar crime there a couple of years ago, and there's a long gap between when the crime happens and it comes out in the paper between when the actual prosecution, and that's been a couple of years, and it's just going through sentencing and things like that now. Pipestone is a small community. How is the community reacting to you? I mean, do you still go out into the community, and you obviously still live there now, or close?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question. At the time that this was going on, and it was in the paper during the time that we were in trouble, before that I went to prison, it was very difficult. Well, at first, there wasn't really that much. I mean, I knew what was going on because my lawyer had contact with the government and so on and so forth, but it wasn't all just in the paper. About the last year, it really became the worst, and I sort of just didn't go anywhere then. It's something we went to the store or something like that, but I tried to just not. I wasn't really interested in socializing, so we go over to either my wife has a lot of family in the area, right around Pipestone, or we go to a friend's place or something like that. But since I came back, I had to, had to kind of decide about what we wanted to do. And I said to Marlos, I said, well, do you want to stay in Pipestone, or do you want to go somewhere else? She said, are you kidding? Why would we go somewhere else? I said, well, I just thought maybe you felt uncomfortable or shy, uncomfortable. So, everybody knows what happened, but what happened happened, and you hopefully come back as a better person, and you try to do good things for the people that you're involved with. So, I have been absolutely astounded at the reaction of most people. Some people I would have never ever dreamed would have come up to me when I came back. I have people I hardly don't know that well, and they come up and they'd see them like out of the car at the grocery store or something like that, and they'd say, Dave, man, it's good to see you back, and they'd hug me, and I think, well, I hope I remember their name, type thing. But it was very nice of them, and very kind to. I think that probably there was a sense that people had that how difficult it would be potentially to return to a small town and to be around people, particularly when the bank thing. I don't mean to say this in a derogatory way, but I don't think most people ever even really figured out what the heck happened there. The bank didn't close, and the Morgans ended up selling it later on, but nobody lost any money. There wasn't any business. We did a lot of business in town. We spent a lot of money, and so nobody didn't get paid or anything like that. So nobody really didn't quite connect all the dots on that one. But certainly the issue of the things with the city when I was in the city, that was people certainly remember that and understand that. Everybody understands riots. So. It was that was the difficult thing, I thought. But again, mean, all you can do is just try to come back and be a better person and just live your life. And I don't try to go out, make any splashes any place or anything like that, but we certainly go all the places we want to go and find that people are really more than kind. Not absolutely 100%, but by and large, more than kind about saying how glad they are that you're back in town.
Sir, do you have a question? No? Do you have a question before?
I did. I guess I was just curious. For me, a lot of knowing what's right and wrong is more a feeling than it is logical thought. And it sounds like some of the things that you did that were wrong or even illegal, you might have started with good intentions, like helping, what was it, Mr. Winters?
Winter.
I mean, did you have that gauge? Did you have that feeling that what I'm doing is wrong, or
Yeah.
did you know at the time that you were making an action that it was wrong, whether legally or?
Yes, I did know that, and I think that it's a good thing that there's good perception to get the drift of sort of go from trying to help Winter into doing something wrong. Initially, in trying to, I mean, I didn't say to myself, hey, I'm sure glad that old Bill told me this because now this is a chance to get some money from Billy. That really wasn't the beginning of how it was. The beginning of it was to help the guy, you know, because Dad asked me to. I didn't really feel quite right about it from the standpoint of trying to get direct business to him from city business, but I wasn't thinking about anything for myself. I was just thinking, you know, well, okay, this isn't probably the right way to do things, but you know, but I was doing it to help the guy. Well, then of course it sort of morphed into something different than that, and so yes, I knew that it was the wrong thing later on. As a matter of fact, my mother. Having been raised in the Baptist church, my mother had a slew of verses that she would keep throwing at me as I was growing up. And most of them had something to do with me going to hell if I didn't do the right thing. But in any case, I remember when I got money, I had this little place I hid it. When I got money from Winter, I had this little place that I hid it, and I remember sometimes I would put this, it was up in my closet underneath some sweaters, and so I put the money up there in a little envelope. This was a very sophisticated deal. Had a little envelope, and I put the money up there, and somebody said $1,000, $2,000 in it or something. I remember thinking to myself several times, particularly as time went on. I remember what my mother told me this one verse about, be sure your sins will find you out. Well, I knew that, and I just sort of like tried to put that out of my mind and just go on with doing whatever I was doing. But I knew in the back of my mind that it was the wrong thing, that someday maybe when I went into business, time went by, a lot of years went by. This is stuff that part of the reason they couldn't figure out a lot of this stuff is so much time went by was it was basically almost time barred. That they sparked terms of prosecuting me for that. And there maybe was some way they could have tried to weave it together, but it would have been a little tough because it was way back. And I thought to myself, gosh, that stuff's behind me. Maybe I'm going to get away with it. And I was smart enough I destroyed every shred of evidence that anybody could have ever gone and sort of found that I had any control over. If Bill Winter would have got hit by a bus the day I left the city and killed, it would have been really hard for the government, I think, to try to put two and two together. But that's the thing about, and that's the other thing about when you do something wrong. Almost always, and you can think about this in your own life, and nobody, of course, has to say anything, but almost always when you've done anything that maybe is a little wrong, you probably had somebody else involved. Believe me, that's where your downfall is whenever, no, obviously you shouldn't do anything wrong for a lot of reasons, but that's the one that will get you.
In business, it's impossible almost not to have that be the case. I mean, the reality, Dave mentioned this earlier, I sometimes say similarly, the people I prosecuted look like the people in the audience. Almost to a T. The white-collar business executives, certainly the professionals that I prosecuted, and there are many of them, I would say few, if any, ever woke up the morning of their criminal conduct and said, today I'm going to commit a federal felony. Today I'm going to go and commit a white-collar crime. It's just not the way that you operate. The bank robber does. the drug dealer does. They know when they wake up, that's the day they're going to commit a crime. I mean, corporate executives, it's the little things that open that door. Expense account abuse, cheating on the tax return, common failure that leads to more, because typically, when it's a small matter, whether it's in your company or whether it's the competitor, you get away with it. And that starts to create the mindset, you know, I came out ahead here. No accountability, no sanction. And the next time you do it, I prosecuted 15 lawyers in the last 10 years, all convicted, most of them for stealing client funds. And none of them would ever have thought themselves a thief or described themselves as a thief. They were borrowing client funds to cover other expenses. But once they started doing that, the second time got easier, the third time easier. Expense account abuse is rampant for businesses. And all of you in business are going to have that temptation. If you work for a university, you're going to have that temptation about getting reimbursed for your travel. Every one of us, April 15th, has that temptation. The first time you do it is by far the most important, because it will get easier, and there's very few people who do it 3 or 4 times who have the ability to stop doing it. Steve?
I'll ask you to share Mike's, because I think his mic's gone off. You can share that with him. I don't know what the answer is. I've been to the federal prison camp now for like 7 or 8 years, and I've met a lot of people that you probably put there. And you're right, they look like us. And that's one thing that amazes my students. They look and talk and read the same journals and everything that we do. But there's 2 things that they say. One thing they say is, help your students understand that when it's United States versus Logan, the United States is going to win. And so maybe you can talk about the percentage of times that you actually win. The second thing they say is, please tell your students about the federal sentencing guidelines. It's your first time. It's your first offense. And yet, if the offense level is high enough, you're going to serve this much time. So if you could speak to that.
Well, I don't have the exact statistics, but I think that clearly 95% or more of the cases we bring, we win. In Minnesota, it might even be a little bit higher than that. So the percentages are against you if it's your government, your federal government, versus you as an individual citizen. There's another point too. Even when you go through something like this, I mean, if you win the case, first of all, there's always the IRS. I mean, the IRS always is in the background in every case that I bring, because if you get money illegally, that's undeclared income. And I've only had a few people in my 20 years who've actually gone and declared the income that they had embezzled or that they had taken by fraud. A few did, but and the IRS is always there. And then the consequences of the civil regulators, if you're in a regulated industry, I mean, there are so many aspects to the government in our lives these days that there are no winners. Which goes to an earlier point that, you know, if Dave Logan had come in when I first asked him to come in, the whole case would have been different. And that's I think, the bottom line. On the guidelines, when Dave Logan was sentenced, he was sentenced to guidelines that were mandatory, that the judge did not have any real ability to deviate from. The law has changed since then, and now the guidelines are viewed as advisory, much like in the state of Minnesota. If you were in state court in Minnesota, that the judges now have more discretion to go above and in more cases below the guidelines. So there's more flexibility. But back, you know, when I was negotiating with Dave Logan's first attorney, his attorney kept saying, well, the bank's not going to lose any money. And I said, well, the OCC, the regulators say that doesn't matter to them because the bank was on the hook, and if the bank had failed or if this business had failed, the taxpayer would have to pay the bill, millions of dollars. And I said this to Dave recently, thank the Lord for him and for Pipestone. This is the 3rd largest employer in the entire county of Pipestone. We're talking about his business. Thank the Lord that their gamble paid off, that they grew, that they were profitable, that the bank didn't get cheated. Because if it was today, and they were facing the economic circumstances we're all facing today, there's going to be legions of stories of people who maybe had good intentions when they started out. They just wanted to grow their business, but submitted false documents or false certifications. And in today's environment, I mean, you can see what's going on now in Chicago, and it's going to be going on in other parts of the country. Wall Street, I mean, the federal prosecutors are out en masse, and the subpoenas are everywhere on Wall Street to find out who broke the law, who should be held accountable for our economic crisis. And the timing was fortuitous for their company, and we had a difficult choice. I had just finished a case where I had seized the company, George Klein's company, and forfeited it to the United States. And we heard the money went to Washington, D.C. By the time we got through with the company, people weren't going to be put out on the streets. We could have done that to Global Ventures. We could have seized it, had marshals go in and put up U.S. government signs on it. The likely prospect to me was the company gets sold in a fire sale, maybe liquidated. That's happened in most of the cases where I've gone and seized the asset. It made no sense to me to do that. Regardless of what Dave Logan and Mike Morgan had done, you had a lot of people whose jobs were dependent and who had done nothing wrong. So that's why we fashioned this extraordinary restitution remedy. And we did it in other cases with other companies as well. I just recently finished a case, a large publicly traded company in the Twin Cities where, yes, if I had pushed it and gotten a felony conviction, they would have lost their export license, 80% of their business, and 1,000 Minnesotans would have lost their jobs. And yes, we would have been justified under the guidelines and under the department policies to do it. That made no sense to me. So we did something far different. And I think that's one of the messages I want to leave today.
Can you imagine these guys trying to raise pigs?
No, I mean, I said that to my FBI agent at some point. I said, you want to ask the marshals, how many pigs did you guys have at that point? It was an unbelievable.
100,000.
100,000, huh? And I said, who's going to, the government wants to go out to Pipestone and try to run this business? And I didn't have any disagreement. Ma'am?
I was wondering what your thoughts were on what was the most impactful part of your punishment. Was the financial restitution or the time in prison? Would one without the other have been as impactful? Or can you speak to that?
Yeah. Mr. Shea started out his talk today by asking you the 3 questions. And one of them was, that at the end there, you can only choose one. And I wish he would have suggested that to the judge when I was getting sentenced. But in any case, because the judge picked both, I would certainly have paid way more money to avoid the time at the time. I mean, if somebody would have said to me, I had to pay $750,000 bucks, plus I suppose we must have spent, I don't know, a couple hundred on the attorney. If somebody would have said to me at the time, would you pay twice that and we'll cut your time in half, or would you pay 3 times that and we'll cut your time down to nothing? I had to figure out how to get the money. I mean, I didn't have the cash at the time, but I would have got it. However, looking back on things, at one time when Mr. Shea and I were speaking, somebody in the audience said, well, why don't you ask Dave those questions? And so everybody, he asked me the questions, and I said yes to the first 2, and then when they got to the part about would you rather, money or time, everybody kind of thought I was going to say money, but I said time. And the truth of the matter is that I think that in order to get the attention of somebody who has done something, who has had a depletion of character to the point where they've done something wrong for a long time and repetitively, the only way to really get their attention is to do something that nobody wants to have done to them, and that's lock them up. Now, I lost my liberty. I wasn't in like, I don't know, you guys probably seen that show on TV, Oz. Well, it wasn't like that, but I mean, it was, you couldn't do what you wanted to do. You couldn't go anywhere. You had to be there where you had to do what they told you to and all that sort of thing. That was very, very difficult, particularly for somebody who is not used to doing that sort of thing. So I think that the hardest thing was the time. The money, I didn't like that, but I mean, money's just money, and our business has been very, very successful. I'm not saying that to my credit. My nephew runs the business now and has ever since I went to jail, and he's done a wonderful job, and he's learned a great deal about hedging, and has done an excellent job hedging to be able to to make the business successful, even in tough times. So, you know, the monies we've been able to get back, but the time you can't get back, and the time that, you know, my little grandson Sam was just a little kid at the time when I first went in, just a little tyke, and by the time I got out, I was lucky when I got out, I was able to go to his 5th birthday party. My little grandson Scott, he wasn't even born. He was born while I was in prison. My 2 granddaughters who live in France, Lucy and Audrey, you know, they'd have to come and see me. The only way I could see them was when they came to the States for the summer, and Marlis and Heidi, our daughter Heidi, would drive them up there, and I'd see them at the visitor center at the prison. So, now let me just say one thing about the prison system, and Steve is probably aware of this too. You know, actually, they try to do a fairly decent job of trying to keep your family, to have supportive relationships, and so the visitor center doesn't look like, I mean, frankly, to tell you the truth, it sort of looks like this. So it's not that bad. The kids could never quite figure out why I wasn't leaving when they were leaving, but you know, it wasn't as bad as it could be. But all those things you missed in your life, and you can't get those back.
One other quick addendum to that, this is something that's changing, thankfully, after 20 plus years. There are 4 federal prisons in Minnesota. They are all for men. In the last 10 years, more than half of my embezzlement cases involve women. And that's a little known statistic, that women are committing more and more white-collar crime than ever before. Partly because they're the office managers, they're the bookkeepers, they're the ones who are trusted, especially in small businesses with the bank accounts and the funds. And you can point to our gambling issues. I think number one, why most people end up embezzling money these days from small businesses. But my point is that the closest federal women's prison is in southern Illinois, in Pekin. And it's been a real issue for our federal judges to sentence women to prison when they have young children and knowing that they're going to be going to Illinois. Well, this extraordinary restitution idea, as I said, has caught on in other places, and long story short, there's a fund that's been set up here in Minnesota from cases similar to the ones I talked about, and those funds are used to every 3 months pay for buses to take kids, and in some cases spouses and significant others, down to Pekin to stay for the weekend and put them up in a hotel, be able to keep some family relationships going during that time. The government, the Department of Justice, Bureau of Prisons is not going to pay for that. So this is something that the courts have done on their own. That's the type of thing, I mean, I think we need to think about as a society. I mean, do we want to create, in some cases we have no choice, but we want to create even more broken families. The people that we prosecute have broken the law and need to be held to account and need to be punished for that. But I think you've heard from Dave Logan, there are all sorts of other people involved in this process who are also being injured and also being placed in very difficult situations. And those are the types of things that I'm challenging our students, but I want to go beyond that, challenge us as a society to start thinking about. Ma'am?
If there is financial restitution, is there an alternative to incarceration so that states aren't paying for the time in prison? Right? You gave the example of paying for that and exclusion of education, which I find hard to accept.
Well, we spent a whole course this past semester on that sole issue. I taught a crime and punishment course, and the whole focus was on, are there alternatives? How do we fix the current system? Do you have any idea how many Americans are in jail or in prison now in this country? 2.3 million Americans are in jail or in prison. That is more than double any other country in the world. You know, we accuse China and other countries in Asia of human rights violations. We have twice as many people incarcerated than any country in the world, and our per capita rate is twice the rate of any other country. Having said that, there are people I prosecuted who I would not hesitate to say to all of you, they need to be locked up, and some of them need to be locked up for a long time because they are a danger to everybody here, and you would not want them living in your neighborhood. The majority of people I prosecuted don't fall in that category. And what I'm asking the students and our community members to think about is there needs to be a loss of liberty. There needs to be a sanction. Whether 5 years was necessary. And Dave Logan hasn't told you yet some of the things that he did to try and address the education issue that you talked about and the things he did while he's in prison. Most of the people that I work with now have tried to put the best possible light on the time that they spent incarcerated. They're a small minority. Most people that are in jail or prison right now are being warehoused. There's no effort to rehabilitate them. We have abandoned those efforts, and they're not even working in many cases. I mean, they're just sitting and being held to the end of their term. With electronics, I mean, we have the ability to have people placed in their home wearing a bracelet where they can't leave their home unless the court permits it for a work-related purpose. Community confinement. You talked about the halfway house in Duluth. We have halfway houses all over. It costs about 1/2 or less to put somebody in a halfway house than it does to put them in Duluth. Duluth is the cheapest it gets. That's the old Air Force Base, okay, where Dave Logan went. That's the lowest of 6 levels of security. Sandstone, our oldest prison, level 3, I don't know if any of you have ever been there, the prison walls, the guard towers, I had people have to go to there, and they should be there. That costs probably about $40,000 to $45,000 a year per inmate of taxpayer money to keep them there. Oak Park Heights, the state facility I've heard is like $55,000 or $60,000. It's one of the most secure, maximum security facilities in the upper Midwest. We have some federal prisoners that actually had to go there. I mean, for every $55,000 you're paying to keep somebody in a maximum security prison, you can have a teacher. I mean, be added to the rolls. We need to start thinking in a different framework for our future. I can't repeat that enough, and you all are going to be in positions of being able to do something about that. Whether some of you now, and all of you, with your degrees and your opportunities eventually. Take some business strategies and try and figure out how we can hold people accountable, but do it in a way that actually puts them back on the right road again, as opposed to just putting them off for 3 years or 5 years or 10 years without any progress being made, because they're going to come back in our community. And if there's been no improvement, Dave Logan is not the rule, he's the exception. There's been no improvement, there's been no change in values or mindset, guess what's going to happen again? I mean, 1/3 of prisoners recidivate, okay? I mean, as long as that continues, we're kind of fighting a losing battle. Ma'am?
Did the city have any checks in place to prevent that bid altering as far as comparing what was on the piece of paper to what was reported?
No, not really. You know, it's a small town, so there really wasn't a lot of staff, and so, you know, I ended up doing a lot of things, you know, for the good too, just because there wasn't a lot of other people to do it. But when we would open bids, for instance, we'd have a bunch of contractors sitting out there just like you guys are, and then I'd be sitting up there with a lot of times maybe the engineer would be there, who was a consultant, not an employee of the city, but he's a consulting engineer. Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. And then I'd just read the bids, and you know, nobody really ever looked over my shoulder or said, you know, I want it. Now, there was always the risk that you'd run because somebody could do it. One of the contractors could say, well, I want to look at the bids. And it was always that risk. So believe me, my heart was in my throat oftentimes when we did this sort of thing because I didn't want to, because actually the guy wouldn't be as mad about the fact that Bill Winter got more money than he should have because he was the, you know, that he wouldn't be as mad. He'd have been madder if he was the low bid and I read Bill's as the low bid, then he'd have been upset, you know. Because believe me, I mean, I got to know, I mean, I spent lots of time with Bill. We went on vacations and so on and so forth. And I was present at a number of situations where a group of contractors were together talking. And, you know, they sort of, I mean, I shouldn't say this happens in all cases, of course it doesn't, but these guys that he was with there were sort of talking about who was going to get this job and who was going to get this job, and I'm going to bid this for this job, so you bid this. And so, I mean, they, you know, they all were, but they don't mind, you know, as a group cheating somebody else, another contractor, but boy, if you cheated them, then they'd be ticked off, so.
So,
This is for you, Mr. Shea. How many years did you work at Prosecutor?
20.
20? How many times, or what percentage of the time when you got done with the case and everything was wrapped up, when you could sit down or talk to somebody and say, wow, justice was really served here? Did that happen a lot, or was it, you know, satisficing the situation, just doing the best you could? Was there a lot of, yes, what should have happened actually happened?
The better and more experienced I became, the more I felt that. In the beginning, I didn't have a good focal point to be able to gauge that. I would do my best. In the beginning, I also started off with a lot of guns and drugs and violent crime and the like, and in many cases, that's just getting a violent person off the streets. With the white-collar cases, it was more difficult. I mean, as I tried to communicate, the people that I prosecuted there, I will tell you, the vast majority were not bad people. They had made bad and often horrible decisions. But trying to get satisfaction in those middle years was difficult. And that's when I started to change my mindset and say, you know, it's up to the judge to impose whatever sentence is going to be imposed here, but let's try and think about how we can prevent the next person from committing these crimes. The Pipestone case, you know, I'll tell you this, I don't always say it, but Dave Logan went in front of the judge to plead guilty without knowing the questions that I was going to ask him. That was the first time that I could remember. It was at least the first time in 10 years that it had ever happened. Because if someone's going to plead guilty, if they're going to accept responsibility, my standard practice was to bring them into our office before we went up to the courtroom and say, look, this is the first impression you're going to make on the judge. You're going to be under oath. You have to admit your guilt. These are the questions I'm going to ask you. I offered that opportunity to his first attorney, and our relationship, at that point I wouldn't even talk to him. We'd only exchange communications in writing. It was that bad. And I have a letter. I offered it to him again. Bring Dave Logan in, and he said, no way. I mean, his view was, his clients don't talk to the governor. So Dave Logan's plea went very poorly, as I said. And I mean, the story about the truck, he ended up telling that to the judge. We didn't know about that crime. But I had framed the charges in such a way that I said to Dave Logan, start at the beginning. And his attorney objected, which was also never happened in my career. And the judge said, this is a plea hearing, right? This is not a trial. I say, Judge, I just want the court to know everything that happened here. And the judge, of course, said, yeah, well, so does the judge. So Dave is telling us about the truck and about other incidents back in the 80s that we hadn't even known about. And it was the worst possible way for Dave Logan to be making his first impression on the judge. I could tell you for the rest of the day, cases where driving home, I said to myself, I am so privileged to have been in court today on behalf of these victims, because I don't want to brag, as Dave said earlier, but particularly in the last 8 years, I provided a lot of justice to a lot of Minnesotans who I don't think would have gotten. And you know, some of them in particular I'll never forget. Some of them stay in touch with me. But when somebody loses a lot of their life savings and you get some of that back for them, or has been horribly injured in an environmental accident, and everybody blows the person off, and the FBI says, nobody's ever prosecuted this type of case before in the country, and we did it, and we got not only money for him, but for his family, and for the other firefighters who were injured. I mean, there's no better feeling as a lawyer, or even as a person, to be able to say, I made a difference in helping somebody get something back today, and maybe they have just a little bit of faith that the system still works for them.
Sir, Morgan, the maker, went to prison, same term you had since,
No, he got 4 years. He got 4 years, and that too was a case where my predecessors had made certain arrangements and deals with Morgan and his attorney to get his cooperation. He told us about the payoffs to burgers. Again, I asked for 3 years, and the judge said, no, he gave him 4 years. So with both Dave Logan and Mike Morgan, the government's recommendation was not accepted, and the judge gave heavier sentences.
was he also under the
No, he was in Yankton.
There's a camp in Yankton, South Dakota. It's the old college campus there. Most of the people I prosecuted went either to Yankton or to Duluth.
Are you still partners, friends, still communicate?
We're not partners, but we actually bought Mike out sort of during this whole time. He wanted to just get some money and get bought out, so we did. you know, friends is probably, well, we're not, you know, certainly not chums, let me put it that way. But you know, nonetheless, I don't try to hold any grudges against him or anyone else that was associated with the deal. There is a, you know, contrary to what the government, of course, likes to do, and they, you know, it works very well for them, is they use the cooperation, you know, issue, and so if you cooperate, you get less time.
He had a similar guideline range that Professor Castleberry talked about before. It would have been, you know, 50 to 70 months in that range. But because he had come in and done this proffering with my predecessors and given government information we used to further the investigation, he was given credit for that. You know, one other thing I'll tell you about, I think I owe this to Dave Logan. Again, not something that the public knows about, but after that plea, Dave went and hired this second attorney and made him his main attorney in Minneapolis. And that guy called me up and he said, you know, everybody's been pointing the finger at Logan for months. Everybody else had pled guilty. Dave Logan was the last guy standing, and that guy gets the worst deal. I mean, that's just the way the system works. But he said, I'd like you just to meet this Dave Logan. I know you don't have any other cases you want to bring. There's no other cooperation, but just sit down with him. So we sat down for an hour and a half. This is before sentencing. I went back to my office with my FBI agent, who's a veteran FBI agent, one of the top in the state. And I remember I looked at him, I said, Mike, we might have misjudged this guy. I mean, we've heard everybody dump on him. And Dave had still a very responsible role for what happened. I'm not going to try and minimize that he was, I think, the smartest guy in the group. The veterinarian might have been smarter, but in sciences. All right, so the smartest guy in the group usually gets tagged with the most culpability. But I felt, to go back to your point, driving home that night, I had a feeling in my stomach that I wish I had talked to Dave Logan 6 months earlier. And this might have turned out differently. You know, I think it goes back to the first point I talked about. I'm not trying to dump on just this one lawyer, because the legal profession has lots of issues with it, but hire somebody that you can confide in and that you can trust and that you know is going to be there for you. Whether that's your accountant or your auditor or your lawyer, as business people, that trust relationship is the most important thing you've got to have. It doesn't matter what school they went to, it doesn't matter what their GPA was, you've got to be able to sit down with that person and trust that person to give you wise advice that's going to be the best advice for you. And Dave Logan didn't get that, and I think it cost him a couple of years in prison.
I know we're getting close to the end of the time here, and it's been very stimulating listening to your questions, and I'm glad we got a chance to be able to answer, because I know that, and afterwards, I think, you know, I certainly intend to stick around. You know, I'm not in a big hurry to get home, but you know, I'd be glad to talk to you afterwards too. I do want to say one thing, though. This is something that happened to me just in the last few weeks, and I think it's interesting, and it goes to sort of the part of the issue the lady in the corner back there had asked about. Is there another, you know, if you get restitution, is there another way? This doesn't have anything to do with white collar crime, but you know, a lot of the guys that I met when I was in prison there were most of them good share, probably 2/3, maybe 70%, something like that, were in there for drugs. And one of the guys that I got to know there, amongst, you know, hundreds of guys over the years, was from my area, sort of my part of the state. And so I was going to a Vikings game, and I was at the Normandy Hotel in the Twin Cities, and we were at the bar there having a beer before we were going to walk over to the game, and my phone rings. And this guy says, yeah, Mr. Logan? I said, yeah. He says, this is Robbie. I said, yeah, okay. Hi, Robbie. He says, Robbie Mason, do you remember me? And I said, oh, Robbie, of course I do. Yeah. I said, where are you calling from? He says, well, I'm out. And I said, well, Robbie, that's wonderful. That's great. This is a young kid. I see he's probably in his mid-30s now. So anyway, he tells me, now, I say this also knowing when I'm talking to him, I'm thinking to myself, you know, I'm still on probation. So when you're on probation, you're not supposed to have contact with other felons, or if you do, you're supposed to tell your probation officer. So I'm already thinking ahead of this deal, thinking to myself, well, you know, geez, you know, how am I going to explain this to the probation guy? So anyway, I talked to him a little bit, and he says, you know, I've been trying to, he says, told me he was sort of the same jail that I went to. Instead of a halfway house, we went to the jail in Renville County, the Olivia jail. And he says, yeah, I'm over there. He says, Elaine said to say hi to you. And this was the lady that's the administrator at the jail there, and she's just a very nice person. I said, well, Robbie, where are you calling from? He says, well, I'm home. I said, well, when did you get out? Well, Thursday. I said, well, how'd you get home? Because, I mean, you know, I went to the jail there, you know, I mean, and he said, well, I went there, and Miss Elaine said, well, geez, you know, he was there with his mom and his sister from Florida who had come and got him because he'd been in jail for a long time. And she said, you haven't seen your family for a long time. Why don't you just go home with them? So he says, you know, spend the weekend and then come back on, you know, on Monday. And he said, Mr. Logan, he always called me Mr. A lot of the guys did, I suppose because I was old. But he said, Mr. Logan, you know, I thought it was a trick. He said, I went outside with my mom and my sister to the car, and he says, I'm looking everywhere for cops, thinking that they're going to come and, you know, say, okay, now you're trying to escape, you know. And he said, I couldn't believe it. He said, we actually went home. I've been here at my house with my family. He said, I just can't believe it. Well, we've talked a little bit more, and finally he says to me, do you know any chances for a job? And I said, well, Robbie, you know, you're kind of a long ways away from where our barns are. I said, well, you know, we always could use somebody, I'm sure, Robbie, but, you know, it's a long way. And I said, do you even have a driver's license? No. I said, well, do you have a car? Well, not yet. You know, and I said, well, boy, you know, I can help. I'll try to help you any way I can, but I just don't, you know. Well, one thing led to another. I was able to, I talked to Elaine. He explained to Elaine he wanted to go to work for our company. You know, he said, Mr. Logan said he'd get me an interview, and I wasn't going to be involved in any of that part of the stuff because I'm not involved with the company, but on a direct basis. But I did line it up with this guy. And so to make a long story short, Robbie gets a job there, and it works out that we had a house that we had that we'd rented, or actually we bought, and we were using it for South Africans that came over and worked for us, and periodically, and so they'd stay in the house because you had to provide them housing. Well, there weren't any at the time, so we said he could stay in that house there. Well, it all sort of worked out great for him. And I immediately called my probation officer and explained all this stuff to him. And I thought, boy, you know, now what's going to happen? And he said to me, well, he said, I got to do something or other here. I'm going to call you back. And I thought, boy, this could be bad. So he calls me back and he said, yeah. He said, well, yeah, Robbie, I'm going to have him for, you know, when he gets on probation too, I'll have him. And he said, boy, I really appreciate you doing this for Robbie. He said, that's you know, a good deal for him, and I hope this will be a great opportunity for him to get started with something, a good job, and all that kind of thing. So I said, don't worry about it. I understand what you were doing, and you know, it's no problem. You know, you can talk to him, and because I mean, our crimes were of course completely unrelated. So anyway, this is the interesting thing though. So Robbie's nerd, of course, he's scared because he's been in jail for 13 years. He's in his mid-30s, so he went to jail when he was a kid. He was, you know, he got one of these draconian sentences that they hand out to these drug guys that are just, I think, awful. I mean, he was a user, and so he was selling drugs so he could, you know, make enough money to get drugs and all that kind of thing. I'm not excusing what he was doing, but 13 years is a long time. Anyway, he was in the office, and my nephew Bob said to me, he said, you know, he said, what's wrong with Robbie? And I said, well, what do you mean, what's wrong with him? He said, well, he was waiting, he went and talked to Kathy, and Kathy's kind of the human resources person. He said he was sitting in this chair where Steve Perkins sits sometimes when he comes to the office, and this little desk area there that he's got. He said he was sitting in this chair, and he was just, and Bob, you know, showed me what he was doing. He said he was just sitting with his head between his legs like this, and his hands just like this, and he was just shaking. And you know, he had his head just, it wasn't like bowed his head, I mean, his head was like way down like this. And he said, what was wrong with him? I said, Bob, think about it. I said, for 13 years, I said, the inmates don't have offices in prison, only the staff does. And for 13 years, this guy has sat in front of somebody whenever he had to go into his office for his, you know, his 3-month review with his case manager, or even in the doctor or dentist, or wherever else he might have had to go. Every time he did that, it was going to be a bad experience. More often than not. Not always. There's some really good people that are in these prisons, but oftentimes you're going to get treated like you're a piece of dog crap, and because they can get away with it. Because what are you going to do? So that was his experience about going in to see somebody in an office, and he wasn't sure what in the world Kathy was going to do or what she was going to say to him. Well, I only tell you this story just as briefly as I can because I think it's just so indicative of the problem that exists, and that is that, you know, if Robbie hadn't got I mean, I just know what was going through his head. If he hadn't have got this job, which is, he's getting good pay, he's got a place to live, now his mom got him a car, he's working with some nice people that are because we talked to the people, Bob talked to the people in the company and told them the situation, and they're treating him just like they treat anybody else. And so he's getting respect just like as long as he carries his load, he's going to get respect just like everybody else. If he hadn't gotten that chance, I could sense, as I had several conversations with him about some of the problems he was having, getting his driver's license, getting things like that, I could sense the frustration in his voice as he was talking to me on his cell phone. And I thought to myself, you know, I know just exactly how this goes. Sooner or later, if it keeps going like this, the guy's going to say, you know what, screw it. And he's going to go back to doing whatever he did because he's got to do something. And so he's going to find his way back to those old friends, back to those old ways, back to all that stuff. So I say that with the idea in mind that some of you, I assume out there, are employers, or you have a part in being able to hire people.
We're going to close it down. You've been a very good audience. For 2 hours you've sat there, and I know those attention spans. It's been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. These gentlemen drove collectively hundreds of miles just to come to this meeting. And it took a lot of personal courage, Dave, to stand up and talk. And I appreciate that. And I've always appreciated about you. Hank, it was wonderful for you to share your thoughts as well. Absolutely wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. My students, we have a meal next door. Your guests will be there. The rest of you are welcome to. The rest of you are welcome to.